thank you all for attending the second anniversary Americana Coffee in the Gallery. We're just so pleased that you're with us. And on this hot day, we have a good audience in-house that you can see by camera. And thank you all for coming too. Today, we're going to investigate American art as Americana, not with the Indian or cowboy artists that we're famous for, but through the impressionistic and Emersonian and Whitmanesque type of the brushstrokes of St. Louis's really most introspective and certainly our most powerful painter. At least I think that, Frederick Oakes Sylvester. He's one of the most favorite painters of mine from this city, and I hope yours too, which I'm sure you'll become once you hear the presentation by Julie Dunn-Morton. She's now celebrating almost 2 decades as the Mercantile's Curator of Art and the Director of the Library's Art Museum. And in that time, the collection has grown tremendously. And Sylvester's work here led that great surge under Dr. Dunn-Morton's leadership. This fall, she'll be publishing the 2nd edition of the Mercantile's Art Collection Guide. After 15 years, we did that on our 160th anniversary, the first edition. The growth of this collection after 15 years has been tremendous, and she's documented it meticulously. So that's a book for everyone to have. So let's welcome Julie and begin this appreciation of a great artist, an artist, certainly. Julie.
Thank you, John. Before I start, it's a little better for sound quality remotely if I take off my mask, because everyone, that's why you're all back as far as you are. Thank you.
Could you all hear me with a mask on? Yeah, good. All right. I like to always wonder about that.
I've never had the projection that John has, regardless. So I'm going to get started here. So just for the people at home, if you have questions, we will have Q&A at the end. So please use the chat function to type in any questions, and Brittany will convey them to me on your behalf. So let's get started. All right, let's get through all the technology here. Okay. We do. When selecting a topic for this colloquium that highlights the art collection as an aspect of Americana, especially as it relates to our exhibition, theme of the nation, our city, and the Mercantile Library, Frederick Oakes Sylvester was a natural choice. Americana can be many things: books, maps, photographs, manuscripts, but art also played an important role in documenting the early days of westward expansion, as well as the ongoing cultural, social, and political development of our country, state, and city. Sylvester and his art make such a good subject for this talk for 2 reasons. First, the artwork he created documents the landscape of his time, including the industrial and economic development of the riverfront, while it also reflects the styles, tastes, and artistic influence that he brought to St. Louis, as well as other national movements that inspired the city's artists. In addition, Sylvester's role as an art educator allowed his beliefs in the importance of instilling an aesthetic understanding in every student, beliefs that were heartily supported by the school administration, to positively impact the lives and careers of his students. In so doing, he also played a part in the development of the region through his influence on its future citizens. The key element at the heart of Sylvester's entire creative output is nature. Recent scientific studies have documented the many physical, mental, and emotional benefits we all reap from spending time in nature. And certainly Frederick Oakes Sylvester would need no convincing on that point. From his childhood in Brockton, Massachusetts, to his college education in Boston, through his teaching days in New Orleans and his life and career in St. Louis, Sylvester was keenly aware of the varied landscapes that nature presented to him. His artistic response was primarily with paint and pencil, but eventually poetry too was required to adequately express his overwhelming rapture with the natural world. Today, we will examine some selected works from the Mercantile's collections that speak to the artist's response to nature and the landscape, and to how he was connected to and documented some important educational and cultural developments of his day. Sylvester decided early that art education was his chosen vocation, and he enrolled in the Massachusetts Normal Art School in Boston at the age of 19. At the time, it was the leading school for art education in the country. The curriculum followed that of the famous South Kensington Art School in London that strove to overcome the negative impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Both institutions had as their mission to train educators to better equip students, the future artists and craftsmen, of course, but even the average consumer, to recognize and appreciate aesthetic design and quality craftsmanship, and to value it over the poor quality and garish design of mass-produced goods. The philosophy is one that Sylvester took to heart, and it prepared him well for the next stop in his career. In 1891, after completing the 5-year course in only 3 years, Sylvester graduated with honors and took a 1-year position at Newcomb College, the women's division of Tulane University in New Orleans. Although he was there as an assistant professor of drawing and painting, the teacher probably learned as much from his experience there as he passed on to his students. Newcomb College was a center for the American arts and crafts movement, and its aesthetic, emphasizing flat, two-dimensional patterns and designs based on nature, inspired Sylvester's own artistic development. And just as an example, I'm showing the cover of the first issue of The Craftsman, the American Arts and Crafts publication from 1901. On a philosophical level, the movement's underlying concept that art is life would become Sylvester's personal philosophy as well. On a practical level, the training methods used for drawing classes at Newcomb College introduced him to the use of more natural elements for inspiration, rather than the classical motifs he had used in Massachusetts. When his year at Newcomb ended, Sylvester took these inspirations and an even greater enthusiasm with him to his next position. Sylvester came to St. Louis in 1892 to serve as art director for the recently built Central High School, shown here in an architectural rendering reproduced in a promotional book published the year he arrived. The school system's administrators were followers of Hegel's philosophy of education. In Sylvester, they found a teacher who could incorporate into the curriculum an emphasis on the aesthetic and cultural values of art, which they felt were essential for a complete education. The curriculum already included drawing, art history, oil painting, watercolor, and outdoor sketching. And 3 years after Sylvester arrived, ethics was added to the high school program in order to, quote, encourage spiritual growth in a material age. This addition was important for Sylvester because William McKendry Bryant was hired to teach the ethics classes. In 1882, Bryant had published The Philosophy of Landscape Painting and had a strong reputation as a scholar of Hegel, philosophy, and ethics. I'm showing the table of contents here of Bryant's book to show a bit of his approach to exploring the history of landscape painting, but especially in part 2, he discusses its key elements. The first chapter is about subject matter and is divided into 2 parts: what the artist sees before him or externally, and what the artist sees within himself. Externally, the artist observes earth masses, water, atmosphere, light, and vegetable forms. The artist then internally observes the spiritual elements reflected in mountains, plains, and those vegetable forms, and the spiritual significance of water, atmosphere, and light. It is tempting to imagine the conversations between the idealistic young art director and the experienced ethics instructor about the ideas expressed in this influential book. Bryant's text states, quote, "The true landscape painter does indeed go to nature for the subject matter of his work, but he also finds his subject matter within his own richly endowed and highly cultivated spirit. Sketches from nature are indispensable, but before these can be taken, there is requisite on the one side a certain course of manual training, which after all is but a training of the soul to intelligently use the hand. And on the other side, a training of the spiritual eye to rightly see by means of the natural eye what is before it." It is interesting to examine one of Sylvester's paintings at this point for any connection with elements of Bryant's philosophy. I love the hum that comes from the room when a Sylvester painting comes out. Thank you for that. It seems clear that Sylvester has, quote, "gone to nature for his subject matter and has carefully observed land masses, water, atmosphere, and light, but that he has also been influenced in his depiction by a spiritual response to those same elements. In this work, as in so many of his paintings, atmosphere and water predominate. Here, the spiritual aspects of nature seem to win out over the physical in a dreamlike composition of soft-edged forms bathed in gentle light." As both artist and educator, Sylvester surely found significant inspiration in Bryant's approach to art and nature. But another change in curriculum at Central High School had an even more profound impact on his work. In 1907, Sylvester introduced a new method of teaching art based on the 1899 publication by Arthur Wesley Dow entitled "Composition, a series of exercises selected from a new system of art education." Dow's methods revolutionized art instruction in St. Louis and across the nation. Sylvester had learned to draw in the traditional academic way and was required to teach rote copying of an instructor's exercise with little opportunity for creativity or expression. Dow's method used abstract designs as the foundation of painting and taught students first to compose the basic structure of the landscape using simplified forms in a flat graphic composition, rather than demanding that they begin by accurately capturing every detail of the landscape before them. This emphasis on first mastering composition, form, line, and the arrangement of light and dark masses gave the students strong foundational skills, as well as an element of freedom and creativity that engaged them and encouraged them to continue. For Dow, quote, "Art study is the gaining of an experience, and art instruction is the guiding of tendencies toward appreciation and the training of mind and hand to create." Here we can see Dow's pages related to flower composition. The point of this exercise was to place the floral form within the space in such a way that beauty is achieved. For Dow, beauty was defined as the most pleasing arrangement of line within the defined space. He emphasized that it is essential, and it was actually underlined in the text, essential that the main line of the flower intersects the space, as seen in each of his examples. And if you'll notice everywhere at the stem, some aspect of the plant form is cut off by the edge of the frame. So for Dow, it's this arrangement of line within this space that creates the harmony and beauty that he's teaching the students to find. This dramatic composition may remind you of Japanese prints, which Dow often cited as an inspiration. And he actually used several Japanese terms in his descriptions. So it was definitely a strong source for him. In this watercolor by Sylvester, we can see how he has incorporated Dow's ideas into a classroom demonstration piece. It shows the artist's facility with watercolor, but also how he uses the Dow method to bring the plant forward in the composition so that the upper leaves and the lower stem are cut off by the frame. Placing the stem at an angle gives further energy to the composition and is a direct borrowing from Dow's instruction. Since it is signed, it may be an example of Sylvester's habit of rewarding the student who had created the best example of work in class. After selecting the best work, he would exchange one of his classroom watercolors for the student's work. This type of validation and encouragement would certainly have been a tremendous reward to any student. In this piece, in a way, Sylvester seems to take Dou's advice even further in the way the grape cluster and vine are located within the space. He has cut off the top of the vine and upper leaf with the top edge of the frame, which you can see up here. And at the bottom, only this merest wisp of a tendril reaches down to, but does not cross the frame. This watercolor, this leaf that's just barely sketched in, is really the only thing in the lower portion that cuts the frame. Pieces like this allow us to see the artist experimenting with the arrangement of forms while still revealing his masterful handling of the watercolor medium. This work is inscribed as a gift, which it's in pencil, so it's rather difficult to see, but it's inscribed to Jesse N. Watson. He eventually became an architect in St. Louis with a leading architectural firm. So definitely a gift to a student. And it's a little difficult to read on the slide perhaps, but I do have this one on the table if you'd like to come up and look at it after the talk. Through his teaching, Sylvester was able to influence a generation of citizens toward a greater appreciation of nature and art. One student noted that, quote, "My contact with him constitutes one of the highlights of my educational experience. Mr. Sylvester developed within his students certain habits of thinking and expression, certain appreciations and discriminations, the value of which have carried over into later life," end quote. It is clear the Dou method dramatically impacted Sylvester's approach to teaching, and we can see it reflected in his personal work as well. Dou's method had students extract portions of a basic landscape using different framing shapes. By examining how the composition was affected by being cropped vertically, horizontally, or in larger or smaller frames, the students learned to recognize beauty and harmony. In Dou's words, quote, "It is not the province of the landscape painter merely to represent trees, hills, and houses, but to express an emotion, and this he must do by art. His art will be manifest in his composition, in his placing of his trees, hills, and houses in synthetic relations to each other and to the space boundary." In 1903, Sylvester became the first art director for Principia, teaching there in the afternoons after his classes at Central High School were completed, and he would remain with Principia for the rest of his life. This is a design Sylvester used as the frontispiece for a book entitled Verses, which was produced in 1903. It echoes Dou's exercises in cropped graphic landscapes that we saw in the previous slide, but also his examples of dark and light composition, which are shown here. It's important to remember that slides can completely negate a sense of scale. This piece is less than 3 inches high. But look at the sense of monumentality Sylvester has achieved in this minute composition. Simple black and white forms convey the massive cloud form, the sliver of moon, and the reflection of light. This speaks not only to his skill as an artist, but also to the strength of Dou's techniques. Realize you weren't able to see those. In Autumn Landscape, we can see Sylvester utilizing the elements of both Dou's methods and Bryant's philosophy to express his own unique response to nature. Here, the artist has placed a row of trees high in the composition, leading the eye upward with pools of water to the openings that invite us to walk between the trees and over the crest of the hill. The landmass anchors the composition, while atmosphere and light define the landscape and trees. Sylvester's massing of light and dark areas recalls Dou's guidance, while adding a sense of expansiveness to the small 5-inch by 6-inch watercolor. As we discuss these two sources of influence, we must remember that Dow and Bryant were certainly not the only sources of inspiration available to Sylvester and to the other artists in St. Louis at the time. As the city developed economically and culturally, exciting new opportunities were available to view works by Europe's leading contemporary artists. In 1883, at least partly in response to losing its bid for the 1893 World's Fair to Chicago, St. Louis businessmen formed the St. Louis Exposition and Music Hall Association to bring international cultural events to St. Louis. I'm sure some of you have recognized already, these are not Sylvester books. In 1894, the exposition opened its first fair, and its art director, Charles M. Kurtz, presented an exhibition of Impressionism. This was the first time that Mary Cassatt's colored dry point prints were displayed in America, and the more than 400 works on display included examples from the leading French and American Impressionists. Kurtz's long-term educational goal for the exposition was to present a new modern movement each year, while complementing that display with installations of historic art periods. Under Kurtz's direction, the annual exposition brought modern art movements not only to St. Louis for the first time, but in many cases, this was also their first showing in the United States. Most notably, these groundbreaking shows included the Glasgow School in 1895 and the Munich Secessionists in 1896. It is worth looking briefly at examples of these works to get a sense of the kind of artwork that Sylvester and other artists in St. Louis could study and view. So these are examples from the Glasgow School, just three representative artists from that group. This was a circle of artists and designers working around Charles Rennie Mackintosh from the mid-1890s to about 1910. And they definitely brought elements of Impressionism to Scotland. They also introduced more emphasis on rural and pastoral subjects. The Munich Secession was the first of the European secession movements to break away from the conventions of 19th century salon painting and salon style exhibitions. And they promoted a radical new way of looking at the role of art in society. And I think we can note that all of these movements actually introduce a freer brushstroke and more tonal color combinations as well. Exposition hall records show that Kurtz's St. Louis exhibitions were frequently requested by major museums across the country, putting St. Louis on the cutting edge of the art world at the time. This provided Sylvester and all St. Louis citizens a rare opportunity to experience the most current developments in European art. Another important aspect of the exposition was Kurtz's dedication to making as much art available for sale as possible. This was a boon, obviously, to the artists who exhibited, but also to local collectors who had an opportunity to view and collect important works. Sylvester exhibited it at the annual exposition between 1894 and 1900, and he would have experienced these expansive exhibitions of leading international styles. Other influences impacted his work as well, of course, including his conversion to Christian Science, his active involvement in the St. Louis Artists Guild and the Society of Western Artists, where he built friendships with other St. Louis painters. As Sylvester progressed in his career, his response to nature naturally evolved. Sylvester had once professed that from an early age, the love of all bodies of water was in his blood. And this piece, which he likely painted during one of the summer trips to New England he made regularly through 1901, we see a boat docked at Fall River, Massachusetts Harbor. Despite the utilitarian subject and industrial location, Sylvester finds beauty in the scene, just as he would in his paintings of the St. Louis riverfront. The cropping of the dock and masts of the ship, which you can see here at the top, and then the dock being cut off over here. And even the dramatic balancing of the large mass of the ship on the left with the smaller ship seen in the distance on the right speaks to Dow's balance of light and dark masses, as well as his instruction for elements to break the picture plane. While firmly grounded in nature, this painting still reflects the artist's inner response to the scene, more than simply the documentary details of the objects before him. Although this is another ocean scene, here the artist takes a broader view, and one minimizing the man-made industrial aspect of the shore. The low horizon is broken by the outcropped rocks and the white sails of far distant ships, while waves break over the rocks and roll onto the sandy shore in the foreground. Once again, water, light, and atmosphere predominate. The small scale of this painting at 7.5 by 10 inches makes it very likely that it is a sketch from nature of the type that Bryant found so indispensable. In 1902, Sylvester purchased Oak Lodge, a cottage on the bluffs in Elsa, Illinois, overlooking the Mississippi River. Although he had seen the river during his years in New Orleans, it was during his time in St. Louis that it took on special significance. His choice to purchase a cottage overlooking the river speaks to the level to which it had become integral to his art and life, even as other artists decried the, quote, muddy Mississippi as not only unworthy of depiction, but even as an unsellable subject. Sylvester's fellow artists tried to dissuade him from painting the subject, but in his capable hands and under his loving eye, his friends were proved wrong, and scenes of the riverfront became Sylvester's most popular subjects. In the 19th century, scenes of urban riverfronts lined with factories spewing smoke from their chimneys were viewed as evidence of industrial growth and economic prosperity. Such images were featured in publications meant to promote the city and lure new residents and businesses. These elements made the riverfront unattractive to artists who preferred tree-lined boulevards and pastoral rural fields. But Sylvester found the beauty there. Here he places the river between the viewer and the riverfront and shows the water tinted pink and blue around the stream of sunlight that intersects it. The sun's angle puts the buildings in a degree of shadow that allows the artist to soften their forms, neutralizing most details, but keeping the landmark dome of the courthouse located precisely where the stream of sunlight meets the shore. The important role of water and light in this piece may draw from Bryant's thoughts on their spiritual significance. While he also gave similar weight to atmosphere, in this composition, it may have been industrial smog more than meteorological phenomenon that created the romantic haze Sylvester has depicted. In a very different approach, Sylvester painted this close-up view of the levee under the Eads Bridge. Interestingly, the work is nearly identical to a much larger painting in the Principia collection. The large masses of light and dark and the dramatic cropping of the composition speak strongly of Dou's influence. Once again, the artist uses water, light, and atmosphere to create a subtle but powerful image. Artists in St. Louis, as in other cities, relied on the patronage of wealthy businessmen and industrialists. For many of these art patrons, scenes that showed their city as growing, busy, and productive were particularly attractive. William K. Bixby, namesake of our own Bixby Club and a major St. Louis industrialist, purchased one of Sylvester's Eads Bridge images. He had a prominent position with the Union Pacific Railroad and was pivotal in the formation of the American Car and Foundry Company, which may speak to his interest in an artwork that depicted the first bridge that enabled railroad traffic across the Mississippi River at St. Louis. Sylvester made his first trip to Europe in the summer of 1906, and with stops in London, Paris, Florence, Naples, and Rome, there was no lack of scenery for him to explore. This painting of Lake Como is one example of many studies he did of the mountains in Italy and in Bavaria. In his encouragement to artists to inwardly examine the physical landscape, Bryant specifically spoke of the spiritual elements reflected in mountains and plains, and the spiritual significance of water. Just the few works we have seen today clearly support Sylvester's stated attraction to all bodies of water. But in Italy, he found a landscape that encompassed both water and mountains. During interviews conducted after his trip, Sylvester commented on the attraction that the mountain scenery in Bavaria and Italy held for him. Although Sylvester made critical comments about the traffic, dirt, and crowds in the other European cities, for Venice he had nothing but praise. He had numerous commissions for oil paintings of Venice from his St. Louis patrons, and he used photographs and sketches in notebooks to gather source material for these works. In her seminal work on the Principia collection, Colette Collister suggests that Sylvester's Venetian work reflects that of another American artist, John Singer Sargent, in his use of a broader and more energetic brushstroke. And I'll just pop in one of Sargent's Venetian works here as a point of comparison. Certainly the intensity of the color is conveyed. This little painting, which is on the table, is under glass, and it wasn't until we got it out from under the glass and gave that glass a good cleaning that we could really see the lovely intensity of the color that Sylvester has conveyed. But it's always nice to have those period frames, right, John? Like to hold on to those when we can. Sylvester was so enamored of Venice that he wrote a poem extolling the city's virtue. But even there, the wonders of the city are tied to the glories of nature. Describing the city as a necklace of coral and mosaic, he states, "Each palace is a pearl, each bridge a jewel strung with liquid threads of gold, each church a star some artist crystallized and brought from far off worlds of light." The poem ends with his claim that he feels even more deeply the twilight and moonlight when they fall on Venice, changing the landscape to a dream. Right, back in St. Louis, Sylvester continued to capture the regional landscape, but with an increased emphasis on rural settings along the river, not its industry. In this oil on canvas, he explores the high horizon line that he used in so many of his vertical compositions. He also has included the pathway leading to the crest of the hill that invites the viewer to imagine what is to be found on the other side. Bryant's philosophy of the essential sketch from nature is evident, as is his advice to observe the landmass, light and vegetation. In this case, as a study and not a finished painting, the artist may not have gone deeper into the spiritual aspects of these elements of nature. The painting does recall Dow's compositional exercises. And just as a reminder, one of the ways that Dow would have the students cut out a piece of the landscape. And you can see how the elements are echoed with the shrubbery here, the tree, and then the horizon we're being led up to. This piece is typical of Sylvester's plein air studies, where the artist immersed himself in nature. A low horizon uses the landmass to anchor the viewer in the foreground and allows the sky and clouds to dominate the composition. This piece is really a cloud study as much as anything else, including the cloud shadows cast across the landscape as the artist explores the play of light over the grass and flowers. In this work, we can see the more energetic brushstrokes that occurred in his Venetian paintings. Sylvester's poetry frequently refers to twilight, moonlight, and other expressions of nighttime scenes. And in this tonal watercolor, we see those ideas expressed visually. With delicate line and subtle shading, he anchors the viewer on the landmass in the foreground, from which the stark lines of the trees reach up to be cropped by the upper frame. We are given the merest hint of the structure on the right and the distant shore on which it sits, just enough to balance the weight and mass of the trees. Compared to the previous oil study, in this painting, Sylvester has observed nature as Bryant suggested, but he has painted purely from what he has seen within himself, inviting us to be open to the spiritual significance of water, atmosphere, and light. Sylvester's poetry has been mentioned in relation to his artwork throughout the talk, and now I will be showing some examples from the Mercantile collection using the overhead camera. And this is actually the poem that he wrote. It's a wonderful example, as are the first few, of his interest in bookbinding. He had introduced bookbinding, leatherwork, all of these arts and crafts skills into the curriculum and continued to explore these himself. So we have a wonderful graphic, an example of his typography work. And again, certainly brings to mind Dow and his compositional approaches. And then sadly, this is, as we like to call it, a well-loved artifact. And so we will simply remove the cover to show the poem underneath. And this is his poem to Venice. Make sure that we are focused for you. So, necklace of coral and mosaic. Sylvester's poetry is not to everyone's taste, but his descriptive abilities were quite amazing, and you can certainly see the correlations with his artwork. And interestingly, we actually have 2 copies. In this case, the poem is printed at the same size, but it's actually the cover. So having read the poem, and again, wonderful typography here, it's anchored at the top. So we lift, and the print is actually loose, but we also have a lovely signature, a little Christmas card for a friend. In this case, Sylvester created a small booklet to illustrate a poem that he wrote entitled The Picture. In this poem, a visitor meets a poet painter, the actual term that Sylvester used, who describes this wonderful emerald pool under a rose sky deep in the forest. The visitor goes there, doesn't find it, comes back, said, I didn't find that emerald pool. And then the artist draws it for him and inspires him. And the visitor goes back into the forest and sees the emerald pool. So I just think it's an incredibly telling poem where you need an artist, you need an art education to be able to really see and recognize the beauty that's around you. So it's a wonderful little poem and beautifully illustrated. Doesn't lay quite flat, but we have a landscape. And again, you can just see the horizon, you got the trees, and then you have trees reflected in the water below. Very much like the watercolor that I showed of the autumn scene. And then you have the poem. Poem completes on the second page, and a wonderful little graphic designed by Sylvester. And I was prepared with the poem just in case someone absolutely had to hear it. The next book, again, still poetry, and again, a quite well-loved artifact. His book of verses. I can never get that right. And this was actually published, in a leather binding. This was his handmade version, which is to me so much more charming and important, but especially in terms of the artwork on the frontispiece, which was the one I showed you in the slide, but here you can see it in person. Just wonderful. Any of you who know me know I'm a huge fan of the tipped in watercolors. I have a whole project going about that. But this sort of thing is so compelling to me. Just the size, the scale, and what he accomplishes there, it's truly remarkable. So I will leave that out so people can enjoy that as well. And I know you're all sitting there thinking, where's the Great River? Okay, it's coming, totally coming. But I couldn't resist showing this as well, which is a piece of Sylvester's letterhead from Central High School. Just want to make sure that we are focused. It's a little Christmas card, a Christmas poem talking about a gift of honey that the recipient is receiving. But what I really want to point out is the logo at the top. It's what I used on the title slide. You might have recognized it. Anybody who knows Sylvester recognize that from somewhere else?
Sure.
People are nodding, yes. It's just such a significant thing for me that this was something he designed for one project and carried it through other aspects of his life. Keep all the pieces together. And now we will see that motif used again on the cover of The Great River. There we are, oohs and ahs, much appreciated. So this book is really the culmination of Sylvester's interest in the arts and crafts. He goes all in on this, selecting the leather, designing everything. The typography is his design. He chose the font, he chose the paper. Every aspect was under his control, and it really is a masterpiece. There were 100 deluxe editions, and each one has a unique watercolor tipped in inside. And so we'll look at just 2 of those today. So here's the cover. Here's your watercolor. Are they not stunning? So again, quite small in size, but just so wonderfully composed. Yeah, I should probably hit our focus again. When I change objects, it will come. And then here, I also wanted to show the paintings in the book relate to particular poems. Yeah. And this is one of Cajuara's photographs of the artwork that are included in the book. And this is our painting, Live Man, Live Strong, Another June is Here. And you can see that in the gallery downstairs. And if you'd like to read that poem, it's on the label. And we do have one other copy that we'll show you today. To have you see this watercolor. There is such variety in the subjects, the compositions, everything. They're just remarkable. All different seasons. I also just wanted to show briefly the actual photograph. I think our color is not carrying quite as well as it might there. But I also wanted to show an example of the typography that he designed and how the page was laid out. Interestingly, Dow also had a section on page design. So the whole concept of book design and book printing was on his mind as well. And you can see elements of that Sylvester would have incorporated. Well, that's all of the show and tell that I have. I want to thank you all for your kind attention. And if you have questions, I'm happy to take some. Spencer, we'll start in the back and work out.
Could you talk a little bit about what's up at Principia? Because I've been up there a variety of times. I never been able to get in to see the collection. How extensive is it? And
Well, it is quite extensive, but it's basically a closed campus because of Christian Science. So you do have to make special arrangements. But it's a wonderful collection. Its artwork is hung primarily in the library. Yeah, special arrangements have to be made. So it's a wonderful collection, and that's why.
For example, would they have many copies of that? Or
I don't know that for sure. Yeah. You had a question?
I did. Where did you acquire your printed material?
Various purchases and some gifts over time. John's been building our Sylvester collection quite well for many years. Tom?
With the ever doing on a larger scale, it all seemed to be.
Oh,
very
absolutely.
small.
Wonderful question, and he very definitely did, especially later in his life, became very active with mural painting. So, and even just if you see our painting, Live Man, Live Strong, it's, 60
I've
inches.
seen pictures of each, great picture, fairly large, but
Yes, he definitely got into larger pieces later in his career. Joan?
Did he leave any specific writings himself about his painting techniques? And when he painted some of the oils, do you know if he sometimes used either a real dark ground or just unprimed canvas or linen?
I would have to look into that some more, Joan, because I'm not sure if what he's left. I know that his archives are held at Principia where he taught, which is natural. But yeah, it would certainly be worth looking into whether he used more of the impressionist white ground or maybe a dark ground. Robert, from your experience, any thoughts? Weigh in
A
for
lot
us?
of the paintings have a very dark ground, but I don't really know the technical machinery of making a painting.
It's a wonderful question, though.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, I can't really speak to that too much.
Questions in the chat?
I do have one from Charles Allen asking, did Sylvester teach at Central High School until the end of his life? And where can you see his murals?
He did teach at Central. The date he stopped is escaping me, but was it till the end of his life?
I don't know.
Yeah, I know he stayed at Principia until 1914 and then passed away the next year. There are murals. There's one in Decatur. There's one that's been rescued and is at Principia. There's the libraries have them, well, the public library has large paintings approaching what you might think of as mural size. Yes. Any other questions, Brittany?
In the comments, sometimes Principia holds events open to the public. There's a wonderful mural in the Performing Arts building that can be viewed at these times.
Right, that's the one we were talking about that they sort of rescued and conserved.
Oh, and then, let's see, who is asking? Roman asks, could the painting Nocturne be considered a tonalist example?
Very much so. Yeah, that's a good question. And there's, among scholars, impressionist, tonalist are terms that are thrown around, and certainly Sylvester understood the use of color so wonderfully that sort of landscape. That's why I liked sort of ending up with that, because it really is all of the aspects of his talent and his career and his commitment to nature and poetry sort of wrapped up in that one painting. Yes, Suzanne.
Julie, what do we know about his life?
Oh,
His family?
there are extensive biographies,
Are there?
many available. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, Sarah, do you have one list?
Follow up to that one. So did he travel extensively into like backcountry to find these scenes for inspiration, or?
No, most of them were actually along the bluffs in Elsa and in the region there. He had some travel to Europe. He had more than one trip to Europe, I believe. And there's speculation he went out west, mostly because of poems that were written. He wrote poems about places he went. So, but the majority of his life and career and his paintings are right here between St. Louis and Elsa, Illinois.
So to piggyback onto that question, and you may have just answered it for us, I was kind of in between, but did Sylvester have a following outside of the Midwest? That's one question.
He did. You will find his paintings still in New Orleans and in Massachusetts, areas that he lived, areas where people knew him. But really the primary audience is here in Missouri. Robert?
Didn't he have an exhibit was it in Seattle or Portland once as well? So
There was one, yeah, there was a
Western exhibit.
the Society of Western Artists
Yeah.
exhibition, because they were more of a regional organization. They did have traveling shows that went to different places. And I believe there was one in Portland that he had a part in. Yeah, just looking at his exhibition history would be a whole nother talk, but really fascinating in the way that it would address how people were seeing art. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been my absolute pleasure.
This is my definition of a great day when we look at Sylvester's art. So, I thank you, Julie. I guess I guess we could think that he was forgotten for a half century, and then he came back in a resurgent way with the great books that came out that sort of rescued his reputation in the early 70s, Williams, Collister, all, but I think that the involvement that the Mercantile committed to with this great painter, through Julie and the way she's drilled down into his technique and art, is something that we can all be really appreciative of. So thank you again. I've thought about this. The Mercantile until 1985 didn't have a Sylvester, and that was a great day when it came. I was always envious of the great pictures that were down the street at the public library, and I thought, well, he tried to give them some art because they didn't have any, and we had all the Binghams and and all the other paintings on the wall, so there wasn't a place. But the Mercantile leadership in the library were very, very aware of his art and what he was doing. They met monthly at the security building. Spencer, that was where the great mural was, that was lost, and then the second one went to Principia. So the library, a block away, always knew about his legacy and his work, and the idea that he was documenting the riverfront was something that they never lost sight of. So it was wonderful, as if he sort of came home and got into our canon a little bit late, but we've never really stopped expanding and trying to celebrate his life since then. So this is the second of the colloquia. The next one, you're in for a treat in September. Sara Hodge is going to speak about the women of the Mercantile Library, and that great story too. So we're all going to look forward to that, and we hope we'll see you all back here again in mid-September for that. So thank you for coming today.